Tyler walked out of my life through a text that felt like a door slamming. No apology, just a cold line about not being ready, and then silence. I read it at Harborview between call lights, trying to keep my face neutral while my throat burned. By the end of my 16-hour shift, my scrubs reeked of antiseptic and old coffee, and my feet throbbed with every step. Rent was due, my fridge was empty, and my baby was growing anyway all night. On the walk home through Boston's North End, I ducked into Port Nero Trattoria for takeout, telling myself I deserved one warm meal. The place smelled like garlic butter and fresh basil, and the air carried that bitter espresso bite that always makes me think of late-night studying. Inside, everything gleamed. Brick walls, candle-lit tables, polished stone underfoot. I ordered the cheapest pasta on the menu and held the paper bag tight, ready to vanish back into the cold. I kept my coat zipped, hiding the small swell of me. I almost made it. Then my purse slipped, like my body had finally quit on me. 1 second, the strap was looped around my wrist. The next, my fingers failed, numb from lifting patients and gripping chart pens all day. Leather slapped marble, and coins scattered in every direction, pinging and spinning like tiny alarms. Heads turned, conversations stalled. Heat rushed into my face so fast I thought I might cry right there under the warm lights. I dropped to my knees, palms on icy stone, chasing quarters and pennies as if gathering them could gather my dignity too. That was when the atmosphere shifted again, but not because of me. The soft chatter drained away, replaced by a thick silence that felt practiced. Forks paused midair. Glasses stopped clinking. Staff straightened. A waiter's eyes dropped to the floor. People stopped watching my humiliation and started watching the entrance, as if something dangerous had stepped close enough to smell. Even the old Sinatra track overhead seemed to fade into nothing. The air turned colder, and my skin prickled. A pair of black Oxfords stopped beside my hand, clean enough to mirror the candles. Above them, charcoal trousers, perfect crease, a suit jacket that hung heavy over broad shoulders. When I looked up, I met winter blue eyes, and the kind of calm that makes you forget to breathe. Damien Moretti did not hurry. He did not need to. The whole room seemed to bend around him, respectful or afraid. I couldn't tell. 2 men in dark suits hovered a step behind, scanning the tables like they were counting exits. My mouth went dry. Even on the floor, I felt like I was the one intruding. He crouched down beside me, smooth and unhurried, as if time obeyed him. I told myself to wave him off, to say I could handle my own mess, because pride was the last thing Tyler hadn't taken. But exhaustion had eaten through my stubbornness. My knees ached against the stone. My stomach clenched with hunger. Damien's hands gathered my keys and MetroCard, setting them into a neat pile, restoring order like it was a reflex. Behind him, one guard's hand stayed close to his jacket, and I tried not to imagine what lived there. Something else had slid farther than the coins, half hidden under a chair. His fingers reached for it and stopped. The glossy paper caught the light, and my heart lurched before my mind could form words. My ultrasound, 12 weeks of quiet panic and stubborn hope, folded in my purse like a secret prayer. I had carried it for days without showing anyone, because the printed name in the corner made everything real. Damien's gaze dipped to that corner anyway. Hannah Brooks. The air thinned. I snatched the photo back so fast it bent, then pressed it to my chest like armor. I forced myself upright, scooping the last coin and pretending my hands weren't shaking. The room stayed silent, waiting for what he would do next, like my life was suddenly a story everyone already knew the ending to. Damien's attention held me steady. Not kind, not cruel, just certain. For a moment, I hated how safe that certainty felt. Then I fled into the night with my takeout and my secret pressed tight against my heart. Outside, the wind slapped my wet cheeks. Back in my apartment, the radiator hissed and the hallway smelled like old laundry, and still I could taste Port Nero's espresso on my tongue. I laid the ultrasound on my table and stared until my eyes blurred, replaying the way the restaurant had bowed to him, the way he had knelt anyway. I told myself it was a random humiliation, a stranger's moment of help, but deep down I already knew it wasn't random. Nothing about Damien Moretti ever felt accidental. I left Port Nero with my takeout bag clenched in one hand and my ultrasound pressed to my chest with the other, like the paper could stop my heartbeat from broadcasting panic. The North End air hit my overheated face and turned it into a cold mask. Behind me, the restaurant's warm light spilled onto the sidewalk, and I could still feel the weight of all those eyes. My body wanted to sprint. My pride wanted to pretend none of it happened. My stomach just wanted food. I told myself I didn't need anything from Damien Moretti. Not help, not pity, not whatever kind of attention made an entire room go quiet. but the way things moved around him felt like gravity. A manager's frantic nod, a server already shifting directions, Caleb appearing at my side without a single wasted motion, positioned like a door that could open or close depending on Damien's mood. I remember thinking I should refuse everything on principle, then feeling my knees wobble and realizing principles don't keep you standing after a 16-hour shift. So I accepted what I could pretend was harmless. A proper meal arranged like it was the most normal thing in the world. A safe ride home framed as concern, but carrying the quiet certainty of expectation. I didn't agree out loud in my memory as a clear sentence. It was more like my exhaustion gave a tiny nod before my mouth could fight, and Damien's presence, steady and unreadable, made refusal feel like trying to push back the tide with my bare hands. The SUV waiting at the curb looked like it belonged to a different city than mine. Dark windows, clean lines, leather so soft it felt unreal beneath my fingertips. Caleb opened the door, and I slid in, suddenly aware of how cheap my coat felt, how wrinkled my scrubs were under it. As the car moved, I watched Boston blur by and tried to separate gratitude from fear. Every part of me knew I was safe in that back seat. Every part of me also knew safety shouldn't feel like permission being granted. My apartment didn't so much welcome me as admit me. The hallway light flickered. The radiator hissed like an annoyed cat. Inside, the place smelled faintly of laundry detergent, and the cheap candle I lit when the loneliness got too loud. Second-hand sofa. Wobbling coffee table. A stack of nursing textbooks I kept meaning to sell but never did, because they reminded me I had earned something once. I set the ultrasound down and stared at it until my eyes stung, replaying Damien's fingers pausing over my name like it meant something to him. I tried to convince myself it was over. A weird night. A rich stranger who had watched me fall apart and decided to do one generous thing before returning to his polished life. I kicked off my shoes, washed my hands like I could wash away his attention, and reheated the cheap pasta anyway, because hunger has no patience for pride. I ate standing up at my counter, one hand resting on my stomach without thinking, as if my body was already learning a new habit. The knock came before I could finish the last bite. My whole spine tightened. Through the peephole, Caleb stood there with multiple bags, heavy enough to pull his arms down. He didn't look angry, friendly, or apologetic. He looked like a man completing a task. When I opened the door, he held the bags out and waited for me to take them, as if the exchange had been decided long before I had any say in it. I carried the food inside in 2 trips, stunned by the weight and the smell alone. Roasted vegetables, grilled chicken, fresh bread, pasta that wasn't the cheapest option, and dessert tucked in like an afterthought. It was abundance in plastic containers, and it hit me harder than the coins on the marble. There was also a small envelope, thick paper that didn't belong in my apartment. I opened it with fingers that felt clumsy. Damien's handwriting was neat and confident. A few simple words about eating properly and taking care of myself, followed by a phone number. Nothing threatening, nothing explicit. And somehow that made it worse, because it felt like he had seen right through me. I told myself I would never use it. I set the card on the table like it might burn my skin. I wanted to throw it away immediately, to prove I wasn't the kind of woman who could be bought with food and concern, but I didn't. I cleaned my kitchen slowly, then sat on the sofa with a container of warm vegetables and ate like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be nourished. Comfort spread through my body in spite of me, and shame followed right behind it. Because needing help is one thing, having it arrive with perfect timing is something else. The next morning, I walked into Harborview Medical Center telling myself I'd put the whole thing in a mental box labeled strange and finished. The hospital smell of disinfectant and overbrewed coffee wrapped around me like a familiar blanket. I made it 3 steps past the staff room before someone intercepted me, speaking with that careful tone people use when they're delivering news they assume you'll accept. A new badge was pressed into my hand, my name printed crisp and official. My assignment changed, effective immediately. Reduced workload. Same pay. The words didn't make sense together. My stomach dropped in a way hunger never caused. I stared at the badge, then at the hallway leading toward the private wing, where everything was quieter and shinier and guarded. I wanted to disappear into my normal routine, into patient charts and call lights and the comfort of being invisible. Instead, I felt myself being moved like a piece on a board, and I knew exactly whose hand was hovering above it. The new badge felt heavier than plastic should. It sat against my palm like a verdict as I crossed the lobby at Harborview, trying to breathe through that tight, sour knot behind my ribs. I kept telling myself there had to be a normal explanation, some scheduling glitch, a lucky break. Anything that didn't sound like Damien Moretti reaching into my life the way someone reaches into a coat pocket. already knowing what they'll find. The elevator to the private wing opened with a soft chime that sounded too expensive for a hospital. The floor numbers ticked up, and with each one the air seemed to change. Less bleach, more faint citrus from hidden diffusers. Less noise, more hush. Even the fluorescent lights looked different up there, warmer, steadier, like the building was trying to impress someone. When the doors slid open on the 8th floor, it wasn't a hospital anymore. It was a corridor staged to look like calm. Thicker carpet under my shoes. Framed art that didn't feel like generic donations. A low hum of climate control instead of the usual chaos of rolling carts and call bells. People spoke softer, moved slower, as if the volume had been turned down out of respect, or fear. I walked forward, and the nurse station turned toward me like they'd been waiting. Not in the normal way staff notices a coworker, but in that sharp, prepared way you see when a VIP walks through. My name seemed to land in the air before I even said it, as if it had already been carried here. A charge nurse I didn't recognize glanced at my badge and gave me directions that felt pre-decided, like my day had been written on a clipboard before I clocked in. Outside the room, a man in a dark suit stood perfectly still. Not a hospital security uniform, not a visitor fidgeting with a phone, a professional barrier. His eyes swept me once, quick and cold, and then he stepped aside with a small motion that made my skin prickle. It wasn't friendliness, it was permission. The kind that says you may enter because someone important has allowed it, not because you belong. Inside, the room looked like a hotel suite pretending to be medical. A plush chair near the window. A private bathroom. A flat screen mounted neatly beside the monitor. The patient in the bed didn't look helpless, even with an IV line taped to his hand. Frank Moretti had silver hair combed back and a face that carried age like confidence, not decline. His eyes were sharp in the same way Damien's were, but softer around the edges, like warmth had learned to live there. The moment he saw me, his expression turned welcoming, almost amused, as if we were old acquaintances instead of strangers. The familiarity was disorienting. I hadn't earned it. I hadn't asked for it. And yet he looked at me like I was already part of a story he'd been hearing about. I felt it in the way he studied me from head to toe. Not in a leering way, but like a man who reads people for a living and enjoys what he finds. I snapped into my nurse routine because it was the only solid ground I had. Gloves, sanitizer, blood pressure cuff, the soothing rhythm of numbers and notes. I focused on the monitor, on his chart, on the steady beep that meant life was continuing normally. But while my hands moved with practiced calm, my mind ran in circles. How did this happen overnight? How did my badge change before I could even question it? How did Frank Moretti know my name like it belonged in his mouth? He talked while I worked, the way some patients do when they're lonely, except his loneliness didn't show. It felt more like he was inviting me to see the world behind his son without making it obvious. In my memory, he spoke about coming to America with almost nothing, about building something that people now treated like a kingdom. He mentioned Damien's mother in a way that turned the room quieter, a grief kept under glass. He framed Damien's adulthood as something forged early, shaped by responsibility instead of choice. And threaded through all of it was this gentle, pointed message. Damien didn't become interested in people casually, and when he did, it meant something. Every so often, I caught the suited guard outside shifting his stance when I walked past the door, like I was no longer just staff. At the nurse station, voices changed when I approached, polite in a way that made me feel watched. Even the way my chart notes were received felt different, like my words carried weight they'd never carried before. I hated it. And I couldn't deny that some small, exhausted part of me also felt safer in it, which made me hate it more. By the time I finished my assessment, my professional mask was tight enough to crack. I left the room and walked straight to the bathroom, locking myself into a stall like a teenager hiding from gym class. My heart was racing, not from running, but from the pressure of invisible hands moving pieces around me. I pressed my palm to my stomach and tried to breathe slowly, reminding myself that my baby needed calm even if I didn't. My phone buzzed. I stared at the screen until my vision narrowed. An unknown number. A single line that said he trusted his father was in good hands. No greeting, no explanation, just certainty. Like he could see the room I was in and the way my fingers were trembling around the phone. I never gave Damien my number. I never gave anyone permission to reach this far into my life. I slipped the phone into my pocket and leaned my forehead against the stall door, anger burning hotter than fear now. I had wanted to disappear. Instead, I'd been placed exactly where he wanted me, in a quiet wing behind guarded doors, taking care of the man who had raised him. And if Damien had the resources to find my number this easily, then my boundaries weren't boundaries at all. When I walked back into the hallway, the carpet muffled my steps like the building was swallowing sound. My badge felt like a leash. My chest felt full of words I couldn't say out loud. But I knew one thing with a clarity that steadied me. I was going to confront him. And something told me he would answer the way he did everything else. Calm, confident, and absolutely unafraid of my anger. That message sat on my screen like a fingerprint I couldn't wipe off. I was still in a bathroom stall on the private wing, knees drawn in, one hand pressed flat over my belly the way I did when my nerves spiked. My phone buzzed again, not with a new message, but with the echo of the first one. The proof wasn't what it said. The proof was that it reached me at all. I had never handed over my number. I had never invited anyone into my pocket, my life, my body. I tried to breathe the way I taught patients to breathe when pain made them spiral. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow, measured. But anger kept cutting the inhale short. I kept seeing the chain of events like dominoes. The restaurant, the bags of food, the new badge. Frank Moretti saying my name like it belonged in his world. It wasn't help. It was access. And access, in the wrong hands, becomes a kind of ownership. As a nurse, I live by lines: patient privacy, consent, boundaries that keep people safe when they're vulnerable. Pregnancy had made those lines feel even sharper, because now my body wasn't only mine to gamble with. I didn't have the luxury of being reckless. I couldn't let a powerful stranger decide I was an exception to the rules just because he liked the way I looked on a marble floor, collecting coins like they were my last pride. I stared at the unknown number until my eyes burned. My thumb hovered, shaking. Part of me wanted to throw the phone into the trash and pretend I'd never seen it. Another part of me wanted to scream. But the most honest part, the part that had gotten me through nursing school and night shifts, and Tyler's abandonment, wanted control. Not the illusion of it, the real thing. So I typed back what I couldn't say out loud in that hallway. I told him, in the bluntest words I could manage without making myself a target, that he had crossed a line, that my job was not his to rearrange, that my phone was not his to reach. I didn't decorate it with politeness. I didn't soften it with gratitude. I hit send and felt my pulse jump like I'd stepped into traffic. The reply came so fast it felt like he'd been waiting, already holding the answer in his hand. He didn't apologize in the way ordinary people apologize. In my memory, his response read like certainty wrapped in calm. He had resources. He used them. He claimed the intention was protection, not intrusion, as if the difference should comfort me. And then he pivoted, smooth as a door closing, into an invitation that didn't feel like an invitation at all. Dinner, tonight, 7 p.m., a car, implied the way gravity is implied. I should have refused. I know that. I could have written a single word and ended it. No. Block. Done. But the truth is, my life was already unstable. My rent notice sat on my counter. My fridge had been empty 2 days earlier. My baby was growing on faith and prenatal vitamins. Damien had stepped into my worst week and made it easier with a flick of his hand. That kind of power can look like salvation when you're exhausted. And still, I hated how quickly my survival instincts started negotiating. I told him I would consider one dinner. Only one, and only if he stopped interfering with my work. No more gifts disguised as policy. No more hospital strings pulled behind my back. No more proof that he could move me like furniture. I didn't frame it as a request. I framed it as the price of my presence. His answer landed with the same immediate calm. In my head, it felt like a man who had never been denied agreeing to terms because he expected to win the long game anyway. He accepted my condition as if it were reasonable, even admirable, and then sealed the plan with that same quiet insistence. 7 p.m. He would handle the ride. I would simply show up. When I left the bathroom stall, the private wing felt narrower. The carpet muffled my steps like it was trying to swallow evidence. I went back to Frank's room and let my nurse brain take over. Blood pressure, temperature, medication times, the dependable rhythm of care. Frank watched me with that soft warmth that made him dangerous in a different way, because it made me want to trust him. He talked about Damien again, not in details, but in tone. In my memory, he kept returning to one idea with affectionate pride. Family is everything. It should have sounded sweet. Instead, it sounded rehearsed, like a rule people lived by when the world outside was hostile. It made my stomach tighten because I didn't know what it demanded, and I didn't know what it cost. Between tasks, I checked the staffing app, hoping to find a mistake. There wasn't one. My schedule had been rewritten in clean, official lines, reduced hours, same pay, private wing assignment, one patient load, effective immediately. The HR note was vague. The kind of vague that means do not ask questions you won't like the answers to. My anger flared so hot I had to swallow it down with water at the nurse station. The bargain I'd tried to set hadn't even started, and I was already living inside his influence. I could pretend I was walking into dinner on my own terms, but the truth was uglier. Still, when my shift ended, I didn't cancel. I went home and stood in my tiny kitchen, staring at the ultrasound on my table, and I told my baby the same thing I told myself. One dinner, one boundary. One chance to find out whether Damian Moretti respected rules or only collected them like coins off the floor. At 7:45 p.m., Caleb was waiting at the curb like he'd been there for hours, even though I knew he hadn't. Everything about him felt timed, measured. He opened the back door of the SUV, and the quiet inside wrapped around me like a thick coat. I climbed in with my shoulders already tight, my purse clutched against my ribs, my ultrasound tucked deep where I couldn't accidentally drop it again. The city slid past the tinted windows in soft streaks of light. I watched brick buildings and corner stores blur into polished towers, and my body stayed braced, like I was heading into an exam I hadn't studied for. I kept rehearsing my boundary in my head. One dinner, one conversation, no more hands in my life. Caleb didn't speak. He didn't need to. The silence itself felt like a message. This evening was already arranged. When we stopped, it wasn't outside some flashy sign or velvet rope. It was a quiet street with a discreet door and a brass plaque that didn't advertise anything. Inside, the restaurant was small and warm, lit like a secret. Maybe 10 tables, most empty. Rich wood, linen that looked too crisp to touch. The smell of bread and citrus and something buttery that made my stomach twist with hunger and distrust at the same time. A staff member appeared like they'd been waiting for my footsteps, guiding me toward a private alcove in the back, half hidden by a curtain and a shelf of wine that felt more like a wall. Damian was already there. He stood when I approached, and the entire space seemed to tilt toward him without anyone meaning to. Tailored suit, calm posture, those winter blue eyes that never looked rushed. He didn't greet me with the kind of warmth that would make this feel normal. He greeted me with certainty, like my arrival had been a fact, not a choice. It made my skin prickle. Caleb stayed near the entrance of the alcove, not hovering, just present enough to turn privacy into a controlled environment. I sat down and felt both protected and trapped, and I hated that those two feelings came in the same package. The table was already set, food already planned. A carafe of sparkling water with lemon placed near my hand, and wine poured only for Damian. The detail hit me in the chest, sharp and confusing. He remembered what I needed. He remembered I was pregnant. He remembered the version of me that had been on the floor, gathering coins, trying not to cry. I should have thanked him. Instead, I felt my jaw tighten because care like that can be a hook. I didn't waste time pretending we were here for romance. I leaned into the discomfort and started climbing the ladder of what I needed answered. First the phone number, then the job assignment, then the way everything around me had shifted overnight as if my life belonged to someone with better connections than me. Damian listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, his attention so steady it felt like pressure on my skin. When he responded, it didn't land like an argument. It landed like a controlled explanation, polished and precise, as if he was used to people asking and then accepting whatever he gave them. He didn't deny he had resources. He didn't pretend the hospital change was an accident. He framed it like problem-solving, like I was a tired woman carrying a child, and he had simply removed obstacles. And that was the problem. I wasn't an obstacle to be managed. I was a person. I could feel my anger flare, hot behind my eyes, and I forced it down because I refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing me unravel. I focused on the plate in front of me, on the way the bread tore soft in my fingers, on how good the food smelled, on how my body wanted to accept comfort even while my mind fought it. Being cared for felt good. Being controlled did not. Damian's calm never cracked, but something in him shifted when I pushed harder, when I made it clear that my boundaries weren't cute. They were survival. I watched his gaze drop briefly to my stomach and then lift again, as if he was trying to decide how much truth I could hold. And then, quietly, he offered one. Not an excuse. A reason. In my memory, his voice softened when he spoke about his mother. Not in a sentimental way, but in a way that made the room feel smaller. He told me she had worked too hard while pregnant, the way women do when they think endurance is the same as strength. He told me complications came like a storm no one predicted. He told me he'd grown up with that loss etched into him, and that something about seeing me in scrubs, exhausted, hungry, trying to pretend I didn't need anything, had hit the old wound so hard he reacted without asking permission first. For a moment, my anger didn't disappear, but it changed shape. It stopped being pure outrage and turned into something heavier. Understanding, maybe. Or the dangerous beginning of it. I still didn't like what he'd done, but I could see the human thread under the control, and that made everything more complicated. I was still sorting through that complication when my phone lit up with Harborview's on-call ringtone. The sound didn't belong in this hidden, candlelit room. It cut through the luxury like a blade. I answered on instinct, nurse brain snapping into place, and within seconds the warmth of the dinner evaporated. Frank's fever had spiked. The staff was concerned, and he was asking for me. When I looked up, Damien was already standing. It was like watching a switch flip. The softness vanished. The calm stayed, but it sharpened into something colder, more efficient. His posture changed. His eyes turned hard, focused, already calculating the fastest route, the next steps, the people he needed to move. Dinner was over. Whatever this was between us, anger, attraction, boundaries, confusion got shoved aside by urgency. I grabbed my coat and followed him out of the alcove, my pulse rising, my mind already running through infection protocols. As we moved toward the door, I realized I was about to see Damien Moretti in crisis mode, not across linen and candlelight, but in the bright, unforgiving halls of my hospital. And I had a feeling that once our worlds collided there, nothing would stay neatly contained again. Boston's night looked soft through tinted glass, but the ride to Harborview cut like cold metal. A few minutes earlier, I'd been under candlelight, trying to keep my boundary from shaking. Now my phone was in my lap, my hospital badge pressed against my palm, and my other hand kept drifting to my belly as if I could steady both of us. Caleb drove with practiced calm. Damien sat beside me with a phone in his hand and a stillness that felt like command. No comfort, no chatter, only forward motion. Inside the hospital, fluorescent light erased the restaurant in an instant. My shoes squeaked on the tile, and my brain snapped into triage mode. Fever spike, older patient, recent procedure, infection risk. Damien's calm changed shape as soon as we hit the elevator. He wasn't louder. He was sharper. He made calls in a low voice, and by the time the doors opened, people were already moving as if they'd been summoned. The private wing wasn't quiet anymore. It was holding its breath. Outside Frank Moretti's room, a suited guard shifted like a gate opening. Inside, nurses and a physician were clustered around the bed. Frank looked smaller than he had that morning, his skin damp, his color off. But he still tried to lift the mood with that familiar spark in his eyes, as if being sick was an inconvenience he refused to respect. I slid into routine because routine is what keeps fear from taking over. I checked his temperature, watched his pulse on the monitor, assessed his breathing, and felt my own pulse slow as my hands remembered what to do. The doctor's update was simple and serious. A high fever, a likely surgical site infection, labs drawn, broad antibiotics started, and close monitoring overnight. No dramatic language, just the plain truth that older bodies can turn fast. Damien listened without blinking. Then he added his own layer of caution, insisting on additional oversight and a specialist review. The staff didn't argue. They adjusted. The power in the room didn't come from volume. It came from how quickly everyone complied. I should have felt offended on the hospital's behalf. Instead, I felt that guilty flicker of relief, the same relief I'd felt when bags of food showed up at my door. It scared me how easily control can masquerade as safety. Frank drifted in and out, mumbling tired thanks, then trying to smile like he was hosting us rather than fighting a fever. I kept checking his IV line, his incision, his chart, anchoring myself to tasks because my emotions were too loud when I let them speak. As the antibiotics started working, the rush faded. People filtered out. The hallway quiet returned, but now it was thick with watchfulness. One nurse stayed nearby. The guard remained outside. Damien stayed in a chair by the bed, shoulders squared, eyes fixed on his father like he could protect him by staring hard enough. I told myself I could leave once Frank stabilized. I didn't. Some part of me chose to remain, and that choice felt like stepping closer to a fire I didn't fully understand. Late night in a hospital is mostly sound without words. Distant carts, soft alarms, and the steady beep that measures time. Damien and I sat side by side in the dim light, not talking, just existing in the same narrow space. Every so often I caught him watching my hands as I checked vitals and updated notes, like he was trying to memorize competence. It didn't feel like being stared at. It felt like being studied for weakness and finding none. Around 2 a.m, my body finally gave up. My head tipped. My shoulder brushed his arm, and I expected him to pull away. He didn't. He shifted, steadying me. And his jacket settled over my shoulders, warm and heavy, turning my shiver into a slow exhale. Morning light found me embarrassed before it found me awake. I blinked at the blinds, realized I'd slept against Damien, and felt heat rush to my face the way it had on the marble at Port Nero. Damien was still upright, eyes tired but controlled, as if he'd spent the night holding himself together. Frank opened his eyes and looked between us with a weak, knowing warmth that made it feel like a family scene I hadn't agreed to yet couldn't deny I wanted. A nurse reminded me my next shift wasn't for hours, and that rest mattered. Damien rose like he'd decided something, and offered the obvious solution. He would take me home. I should have refused. Instead, I stood, swayed, and followed, already picturing my tiny kitchen and the cheap coffee that suddenly felt like a doorway. In the elevator, I kept a palm on my belly and wondered if I was home alone, or if I'd invite him for coffee. The city looked washed clean in the early morning, like Boston had held its breath all night and was finally letting it out. Damien drove without rushing, hands steady on the wheel, streetlights still blinking over empty crosswalks. My head felt stuffed with cotton from the vigil, and my body kept replaying the night in little clips. Frank's fever, monitors beeping, Damien's jacket on my shoulders. I should have felt only unease. Instead, relief kept showing up like an uninvited friend. I watched the harbor haze and tried to rebuild my walls in my mind. One dinner, one boundary, no more surprises. But sitting beside him in the quiet car, I couldn't deny the strange safety of his silence. He wasn't charming me. He wasn't demanding anything. He was simply there, a solid presence while my nerves shook. When we stopped in front of my building, the words coffee came out of my mouth before I could filter them. I surprised myself, and I saw a flicker of surprise in him too, like he hadn't expected to be invited into the part of my life that wasn't polished. Upstairs, my apartment greeted us with its usual honesty. The radiator clanked. The fridge hummed like a tired animal. My secondhand sofa sagged in the middle, and the coffee table had a chip on one corner I kept forgetting to sand. Nursing textbooks were stacked where a decorative bowl should have been. A bag of cheap prenatal vitamins sat beside the ultrasound envelope. Damien took it all in slowly, not scanning for flaws, just noticing. His suit looked almost out of place in my narrow hallway, but he didn't act like it was beneath him. That mattered more than I wanted to admit. He drifted toward the bookshelf where I kept a few framed photos, the only things I dusted without being reminded. There was my mother, smiling in a sun hat on a Cape Cod day trip, before chemo thinned her hair and before I learned the sound of an IV pump in my own home. Telling the story out loud in my head felt easier than saying it to him. Mom had fought cancer for 2 years, and when she was gone, the world didn't soften. It just got quieter. My dad had disappeared when I was 4, leaving behind a last name and a lesson. If I needed something, I'd have to earn it, or do without it. Independence wasn't a personality trait for me. It was survival training. Damien asked, in his quiet way, what I did when I wasn't taking care of everyone else. The question landed awkwardly, like someone knocking on a door I'd boarded up. I found myself listing small things, then shrinking them as I said them. Books, mostly. Cooking when I had energy. Music that used to fill my apartment before grief made silence feel safer. I heard myself dismissing it all, as if joy needed permission to be important. Damien didn't correct me with big speeches. He simply looked at me like my answer mattered. And that made my throat tighten in a way the hospital never did. I busied myself in the kitchenette, grateful for something to do with my hands. My coffee maker was a bargain model that sounded like it was clearing its throat before it worked. I owned exactly 2 mugs that weren't chipped, and neither matched. I gave Damien the one with a faded lighthouse and kept the plain one for myself, hoping he wouldn't notice the crack near the handle. The coffee came out too strong, the way I always made it after a night shift, and I watched him take a careful sip like he was being polite to my entire life. The moment almost made me laugh. While the coffee cooled, I touched the frame of my mother's photo again, tracing the edge like it could bring her back for 1 minute. I imagined what she would say about a man like Damien standing in my kitchen, calm as a storm cloud that had learned manners. I rested my hand on my belly and felt the quiet stretch of my skin, the steady promise underneath it. I wasn't just protecting myself anymore. I was building a life for someone who hadn't even met this world yet. I admitted, almost as an afterthought, that I used to play piano when I was a kid. back when my mother could still clap along from the couch. I hadn't touched keys in years, partly because time disappeared, partly because music makes you feel things you can't chart. Damien's attention shifted, and I sensed a piece of him opening. In my memory, he told me his house had a room with a grand piano that mostly sat in silence, waiting. Hearing that, I felt a door crack open inside me, dangerous and irresistible, and I wanted to see it. Climbing the front steps to Damien's brownstone felt like crossing a line I'd been guarding since Tyler walked out and left me holding an ultrasound and a rent notice. My body remembered the private wing, the fever alarms, the way Damien's jacket had warmed my shoulders. Now it remembered something else too. How easy it would be to let him make decisions for me. I kept one hand near my belly, steadying myself, and I kept my promise in my head. I could leave whenever I wanted. The door opened before I could second-guess the knock. Mrs. Ruth Carter stood there in an apron, gray hair pinned up. She looked at me with the practical kindness nurses recognize, the kind that checks for hunger and fatigue. Then she turned that same look on Damien, full of years of permission. In my memory, she scolded him for skipping meals and teased him for thinking stress counted as nutrition. Damien didn't flare or correct her. He let her talk the way a man lets the truth land when it comes from someone who has held his life together in quiet ways. Watching that, I felt the tension in my chest loosen. For the first time, he looked less like a force that moved rooms and more like a person who could be cared about. Inside, I didn't find a cold fortress. I found warmth. Dark wood floors that creaked under my shoes. Lamps that softened the corners. A hallway that smelled like garlic and rosemary. Bookshelves packed tight, spines worn and uneven, not arranged for show. Framed family photos placed where people actually look at them, not hidden in a study. The house felt expensive. Yes, but it also felt lived in, like history mattered more than display. Ruth led us toward the dining room with an easy authority, the kind that made it obvious she ran this place in the way that counts. Dinner was already set. Simple plates, real food, nothing flashy. Damien stayed attentive without making a performance of it, sliding water within my reach. Watching for the moment, my back tightened, making sure I was comfortable before he settled. I hated how good it felt to be considered. I also hated that my body relaxed before my pride could object. The meal itself was quiet comfort, warm bread, a light pasta that didn't sit heavy, a lemony dish that cut through the richness. Ruth drifted in and out, and each time she passed Damien, she managed to remind him, with a touch or a look, that he still belonged to something human. I caught myself smiling, then caught myself being wary of my own smile. After dinner, Damien led me down a quieter hallway and paused at a closed door. The way people pause before showing you something they've kept private. When he opened it, the air changed. The piano room was simple, almost bare, like the house had tucked its softness away in here. A grand piano waited under lamplight, lid closed, bench aligned perfectly. Nothing was dusty, but nothing looked used either. It felt like a room built for music that had been asked to stay silent. I sat at the bench before nerves could talk me out of it. My fingers hovered, then found a melody my mother used to hum while she folded laundry. A small tune that made my childhood apartment feel safe even when money was tight. The notes filled the room gently, like they were testing whether they were allowed to exist. When I finished, the silence didn't snap back right away. It lingered, thick with memory. Damien stood very still. His eyes weren't cold now. They looked far away, like the music had opened a door inside him he kept locked on purpose. I didn't hear a dramatic confession. I heard fragments, offered carefully. That loss had made this house quieter than it looked. That his father couldn't bear music for a long time. That this piano became a monument instead of an instrument. It hit me in a familiar place, the place where my mother's absence still lived. I didn't try to fix him. I offered a bridge. Someday, if he wanted, I could teach him. One scale at a time. The closeness between us turned charged in that quiet way loneliness recognizes itself. Then his phone rang and the air shifted. His posture sharpened. The other Damien surfaced. A warehouse problem needed him now. He wanted me to wait here. Every instinct told me to leave while I still could. But I looked around at the warm lamps, the books, Ruth's apron hanging on a hook, the piano that had finally made sound again. And I wanted to believe the warmth was real. I stayed, and that choice became my second turn of fate, because I didn't know the next set of footsteps in this house wouldn't be his. After Damien left, the house didn't feel empty right away. It still held the warmth of dinner, the soft glow of lamps, the faint smell of garlic and lemon lingering in the air. I stood in the hallway with my hands folded over my belly, listening to the quiet settle back into place, telling myself I was fine, telling myself I was safe. Curiosity is a slippery thing. It sounds harmless in your head. Just a quick look. Just a minute. I moved slowly, like I didn't want to disturb the life woven into the rooms. In the library, I traced spines without pulling them out. Italian, English, a few in languages I couldn't even place. Some had bent corners and pencil marks, proof someone had read them in the middle of the night and not cared about looking neat. On a side table I found a framed photo of Damien younger, his smile smaller, Frank's hand on his shoulder like an anchor. There was a chess set nearby, one piece missing, as if a game had been interrupted and never finished. A worn jacket draped over the back of a chair, not a suit jacket, something practical. I kept catching these details and letting them soften my fear, letting them convince me the warmth was the real story. I wandered toward the office, the place that smelled faintly of paper and clean wood. Everything was orderly, too orderly. A pen placed exactly parallel to a notebook, a small bowl by the door where keys would land, a routine, a system, the kind of life that had rules even when no one was watching. That's when the front door opened. I didn't see it, but I heard it. The hinge, the change in air, footsteps that didn't match Damien's pace, voices, low and confident, and in English, not the quick Italian cadence I'd started to recognize as his. My body went cold so fast I felt it in my teeth. The warmth I'd been swimming in a moment ago snapped into something else. A trap, a stage, a place where I was the only moving piece. My first instinct was to grab my phone. Then I remembered it was across the room, in my purse, on a chair by the piano room. Too far. My second instinct was to run. Then I remembered I was pregnant and alone in a house I didn't know as well as the people who had just walked into it. I forced myself to breathe through my nose. In and out. Slow, quiet. I pressed my palm to my belly and felt the tight, protective panic rise, then settle into something sharper. Survival. Damien's house had security. I knew that the way you know a storm is coming, not from a forecast but from the pressure in the air. In the office doorway, my fingers brushed the underside of the desk, and I found it. A small button tucked out of sight, like a secret you could hit without thinking. A silent alarm. A lifeline. Footsteps came closer. I heard a drawer open somewhere, then shut. Someone moved with purpose. Not like a burglar hunting for jewelry, but like a person looking for something specific. My stomach clenched. I pictured myself as that specific thing. I slipped backward into the smallest room nearby, a narrow half-bath off the hall, and eased the door shut. The lock clicked loud in my ears. I winced and held still, listening. A pause outside. Another step. I hovered my thumb over the hidden button I'd memorized in the dark and pressed it once, firm and quick. Nothing flashed, nothing beeped. That was the point. I stood with my back against the door, hands covering my belly, counting my breaths like it was a skill I'd learned in nursing school. Stay quiet, stay small, stay alive. A shadow passed under the door. Someone tried the handle. It didn't give. I heard a low voice on the other side, impatient, and then the sound of a phone vibrating. Another voice responding, frustration tightening the air. I didn't need the words to understand the shape of the conversation. They were here for Damien, and I was convenient. My heart hammered so hard I was afraid it would make noise. I stared at the tiny bathroom window that didn't open, at the towel hanging perfectly straight, and thought about how strange it was that panic makes you notice the stupidest details. Then the house exploded into motion. Footsteps ran, fast and heavy. A crash. A sharp, muffled scuffle that sounded like bodies colliding with furniture. I covered my mouth with my hand, to keep any sound trapped inside me. My knees shook, but I stayed standing. I stayed locked in, and then I felt it, even before I heard it clearly. Damien's presence returning like a storm hitting shore. The air changed. The noise outside shifted from confident to urgent. Someone shouted. Another voice answered, and the tone was different now. Colder, controlled, final. The door handle moved again, but this time it was careful, deliberate, like someone who didn't want to startle me. I unlocked it with trembling fingers. The door opened, and Damien was there. His shirt had a dark red smear across it that made my blood turn to ice until I realized it wasn't spreading, wasn't coming from him the way injuries do. It was just there, evidence of a moment I hadn't seen. His eyes went straight to my face, then down to my belly, then back up again, checking without touching first, like he was asking permission even in panic. Then his hands were on my shoulders, guiding me out, placing himself between me and the hallway. I saw a glimpse over his shoulder. One man restrained on the floor by someone in a suit. Another being dragged backward, limp with shock or exhaustion. Not bloody, just defeated. No gore, no hero movie, just the ugly truth that someone had come into this house to take something, and Damien's world had answered with force. My legs finally gave a little, and Damien steadied me, pulling me close enough that my forehead brushed his chest. His jacket still smelled like the hospital night. Comfort and danger tangled together until I couldn't separate them. He moved fast after that. Orders delivered in short bursts I didn't need to understand. The word safe came through his tone again and again. A car was coming. We were leaving. Now. Outside, the street looked normal, which was the scariest part. A quiet block. A few windows lit. Somewhere in the distance, sirens began to rise. Not close, not yet, but approaching like consequences. In the blur of headlights and opening doors, I climbed into the back of an SUV with shaking hands. Damien slid in beside me. One arm braced behind me like a shield, the other settling over my hands where they clutched my belly. I asked myself, what happens now? And the question tasted like fear. Then I answered it, raw and honest. Now I choose protection. Not because I'm weak, because I'm responsible. And as the car pulled away from the warm house that had just turned into a battlefield, I realized the rules were about to change, and I would have to learn them fast. By the time we reached the safe house, my body was running on fumes and fear. The elevator that brought us up felt too quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from cameras and guarded access rather than peace. When the doors opened, I stepped into a penthouse that looked like a magazine spread, all glass and soft lighting. But the first thing I noticed was the thickness of the door and the way it shut with a final, padded thud. Safety has a sound, so does a cage. I set my purse down and realized my hands would not stop shaking. I checked my belly the way I always do when my brain needs proof. Palm flat, breath held, waiting for a tiny reassurance. The baby moved, faint but real, and my knees nearly buckled with relief. Then the anger arrived, hot and clean. I hated that I needed this place. I hated that I had been driven here like I was cargo. Damien didn't try to talk me into calm. He did small things, the way you do for someone in shock. A blanket appeared over my shoulders. A mug of tea warmed my fingers. He asked one of his people to bring plain food, nothing heavy. And I watched him text for a doctor to check me even though I kept insisting I was fine. The tenderness would have been easier if it came from a man with a normal life. Coming from him, it felt like comfort with an invoice. I finally said what had been building since the coins hit the restaurant floor. I was not going to live behind locked doors. I was not going to be grateful and silent while strangers decided where I slept, who I spoke to, and what happened to my job. I told him I would accept protection only if I kept my autonomy. I needed clear rules. I needed to be able to say no and have it mean something. I needed my life to stay mine, even inside his world. To my surprise, he didn't push back with dominance. He gave ground in practical ways. He offered me a phone and privacy, told me I could call the hospital, call HR, and straighten out anything that touched my badge without him hovering. He said his staff would not enter my room without my permission. He had someone bring my purse from the car and left it within reach, like a reminder that I still owned my own things. He even laid out choices for the next day. Stay here with a guard outside the door, move to a guest suite on a lower floor with more space, or leave with an escort to any address I trusted. The message underneath all that control was simple. If I chose to walk away, he would hate it, but he would not stop me. After that, the truth came in measured pieces, like he was choosing words that wouldn't stain me. His family name carried history, some of it respectable, some of it built in gray corners where laws didn't reach or didn't matter. He'd spent years pushing everything into daylight, turning old networks into legitimate businesses, but old rivals didn't vanish just because he wanted a cleaner life. Tonight proved that. They hadn't broken in for jewelry. They came because hurting him directly was hard, and using me was easier. Hearing it said out loud didn't shock me the way I expected. It only gave a label to what my nerves already knew. When the doctor checked my blood pressure and listened for anything concerning, I watched Damien keep his distance, as if he was learning my rules in real time. He sat on the end of the couch, shoulders tense, eyes on the door instead of on me. For the first time since my purse spilled, I felt something like partnership flicker. Not romance, not surrender. Just two people facing the same threat and letting me choose my place in it. Just as my breathing steadied, my phone buzzed with a number I hadn't seen in months. Tyler. A voicemail followed, then a text. And even without opening it, I felt that old abandonment claw back into my chest. He wasn't apologizing. He was asserting. He'd heard I was pregnant, and now he suddenly wanted involvement on his terms, threatening lawyers, threatening to call the hospital, hinting that my life looked unstable and that he could use that against me. It was a different kind of invasion, quieter but just as personal. I looked around at the penthouse, at the guarded door, at Damien's careful distance, and realized I was being hunted from two directions at once. The next fight wouldn't be fists and footsteps. It would be truth. How Damien found me, why he noticed me, and whether that night at Port Nero was ever an accident. The safe house smelled like chamomile and new paint, and yet my nerves refused to believe in it. I sat on the edge of a sofa that cost more than my car, one hand on my belly, the other gripping my phone like a life raft. Outside the windows, Boston looked normal, headlights sliding along wet streets, people living lives that had nothing to do with silent alarms. Inside, I kept hearing the door's heavy click, over and over, until it sounded like a question. Am I safe, or am I stored? And if stored, who decided where I fit? In the quiet, the pieces lined up by themselves. My badge had changed overnight. A stranger had my number before I'd told HR I was pregnant. Food showed up at my door like someone had memorized my pantry and my pride. The intruders hadn't searched for cash. They searched for me. Even Frank's room assignment had been waiting for me, like the hospital had been rehearsed. I tried to blame coincidence, but coincidence doesn't move that fast. It doesn't learn your name, your schedule, your weakness, then appear smiling in the exact doorway you needed, and call it fate anyway. When I pushed him for the beginning, the truth came out in a way that made my stomach hollow. Weeks before Port Nero, I'd covered a volunteer shift at a neighborhood blood drive sponsored by a hospital foundation. An older man had shown up alone, stubborn about waiting his turn, pretending he wasn't important. I'd treated him like everyone else, brought him water, kept him steady when he got lightheaded. That man had been Frank. Damien hadn't followed me for years, but he had heard my name, asked for it, and watched for the moment he could meet me. I sat with that and felt my skin crawl. Not because he knew my name, but because he had carried it like a key. The purse drop wasn't a lightning strike. It was a door he'd already located. I thought about the way the room went silent for him, the way my ultrasound had turned in his hand, the way he'd placed food in my life without asking. I imagined my world as a map on his desk, my routes traced in pencil. A part of me wanted to run. Another part wanted to scream, louder than any alarm tonight. What shocked me was what he did next. He didn't box me in with excuses or soften me with charm. He stepped back, set his phone on the counter, and kept his hands to himself. He had my coat and shoes placed by the door. He told the guards to give us space. A car waited if I wanted to leave, and another plan existed if I wanted to return to my apartment with protection. Nothing in his posture begged me to stay. The power move was the absence of pressure. He offered the door, not the lock for once. That space was my opening, and I took it. I would not be tracked like a package or managed like a problem. If he wanted any place in my life, I needed a minimum of truth and a maximum of choice. No more touching my job, no more help that moved my schedule or stamped my name on donations. No more surprise visits. I needed my keys, my phone, my ability to breathe. I needed the right to leave, at any hour, without being followed. And if he couldn't give me that, I would walk now, even shaking for us. The silence after my rules felt louder than the city. I waited for pushback, for a reminder of who held the power. Instead, he nodded once and made my terms practical. He told his security to stand down unless I asked. He offered to call Harborview with me and untangle anything tied to my badge. He promised no more gifts without consent, and no more information pulled from hospital systems. It wasn't an apology made of flowers. It was an apology made of restraint. In that moment, I understood the difference between possession and protection. Protection leaves room for breath. Then he reached toward tomorrow, and that scared me most. He didn't promise money or a ring or a life where problems vanished. He promised presence. He would show up to appointments if I allowed it, sit quietly, learn what I needed without replacing my choices. He promised my child would have consistency, not chaos, even if Tyler kept throwing threats. I watched him choose restraint over persuasion, and I realized I wasn't craving luxury. I was craving not doing everything alone. Hope rose anyway, but I kept my guard up. Hope had to be earned with time and patience. I don't know what my face looked like, but I felt the ground shift. The truth hurt, and it was supposed to. It burned away the fantasy that I'd stumbled into his life by accident. It also burned away the excuse that I had no power here. I could leave. I could stay. I could demand daylight and still accept help. When I rested my hand on my belly, I didn't feel owned. I felt responsible. And for the first time, that responsibility didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a choice. Next, I would define family in daylight. The first morning after the safe house, my body woke up before my mind did. I opened my eyes and expected chaos. Shouting, footsteps, another door forced open, but all I heard was the soft hum of the city far below and the quiet click of a kettle somewhere behind me. Safety can feel like a lullaby when you're exhausted. It can also feel like a test. I tested him in small, ordinary ways. I asked for space, and he gave it without sulking. I asked for my own clothes, my own toothbrush, my own normal. He didn't replace my life with his. He helped me return to it. The next day, I went back to Harborview with my head up, my badge clipped where everyone could see it, and my boundaries sitting in my chest like a steady heartbeat. The schedule change got untangled the way it should have from the start through HR, paperwork, and my consent. The donation that had turned me into a chess piece got redirected into something broader, something that didn't carry my name like a leash. Weeks passed in snapshots that didn't look dramatic, but felt like the real work of rebuilding. Me in the break room, eating a real lunch instead of a granola bar over a sink. Me at a prenatal appointment, letting him come only after I asked him to, not because he assumed. Me saying no to an offer I didn't trust yet, and watching him accept it without trying to repackage it into yes. The biggest proof came in a moment that almost nobody would notice. A day when a supervisor hinted about rearranging my unit again, and I felt that old panic rise, someone moving me without asking. I expected Damien to step in like he used to solve it fast and quietly. Instead, he waited. He asked what I wanted to do. He let me handle it the way I needed to handle it, with my own voice, my own email, my own signature at the bottom. His power stayed in his pocket. My agency stayed in my hands. That's when I started to believe the difference wasn't just words, it was discipline. Frank stayed a warm constant, even when his strength came back and his jokes got sharper. He kept showing up like a reminder that tenderness existed in that family long before I did. And Ruth returned the way a familiar blanket returns. She'd appear with food that smelled like comfort, with a gentle kind of scolding that somehow made Damien look more human than any suit ever could. She didn't treat me like a guest to impress. She treated me like someone who needed to eat, sit down, and stop pretending I wasn't carrying the weight of a whole new life. The piano became my line back to myself. At first, I only played when I was alone, late at night, hands trembling a little as I sat at the keys. I played the simple melody my mother used to hum while folding laundry. It felt like lighting a candle for her in a room that had gone dark. Then, one evening, I played while Damien was in the next room. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I could feel the way his attention settled, careful and quiet, like he was afraid to breathe too hard and scare the music away. After that, he tried learning. Not in a glamorous way, in an awkward, stubborn way that made me laugh when I hadn't laughed in days. His fingers wanted control, wanted certainty, and the piano gave him neither. I watched the most powerful man I'd ever met struggle with a beginner scale, and keep trying anyway, and the strangest thing happened. The room stopped feeling like a shrine to silence. It started feeling like a place that could hold both grief and something new. Months later, my belly was round and heavy, and my apartment looked like a nest built from thrift store finds and careful hope. I didn't let myself get swept into some perfect fantasy house overnight. I chose every change. I chose what help to accept. Sometimes that help looked like Damien carrying boxes up my stairs and then leaving when I asked him to. Sometimes it looked like him sitting on my couch, reading a dog-eared paperback while I folded baby clothes. Both of us quiet, both of us present. Tyler's pressure didn't disappear. It shifted and flared at the worst times, like a bruise someone kept pressing. But it stopped being something I faced alone. Not because Damien erased it with a phone call, but because he stood beside me while I handled it the right way through documentation, through hospital policy, through legal boundaries that protected me and my baby without turning my life into a locked room. That mattered more than any threat. When labor came, it wasn't cinematic. It was human. It was fear and breath, and a kind of strength I didn't know I still had. I focused on one thing at a time. Inhale, exhale, again. I remember Damien being there, steady like a wall you can lean on without losing yourself. I remember Frank outside the room, not demanding access, just quietly present in the hallway like a prayer. And then my daughter arrived, and the world narrowed into the sound of her first cry. In that moment, all the noise, money, danger, power, pride fell away. I looked at this tiny person and felt something clean and fierce fill my chest. I named her Sophie Marie Moretti, Sophie because it sounded like light to me. Marie because my mother deserved to be carried forward in more than memories. That was my choice, my bridge between where I came from and where I was going. The commitment didn't arrive as fireworks. It arrived as consistency. Damien didn't ask me to belong to him. He asked what belonging would look like for me. He promised to keep showing up in the ways that mattered. Diapers at 3 a.m, patience on the hard days, honesty when the truth was inconvenient, and respect even when fear made him want to tighten his grip. I chose him the same way I chose everything else in my new life, deliberately, eyes open, with my daughter's future in mind and my own voice intact. Dropping my purse at Port Nero was the first accident. Staying that night was the second. But what came after wasn't fate. It was choice, repeated until it became a life. If you've ever struggled with accepting help because you were afraid it would cost you your freedom, I get it. I learned that love isn't the thing that takes your agency. Love is the thing that makes room for it. If this story moved you, take a second to like it, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and tell me in the comments what family means to you on your terms.